Good evening, my friends. Wherever you are in the world right now, whether it's late at night in a quiet city apartment, early morning in a countryside home, or somewhere in between, I'm truly grateful you're here. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to know something simple and beautiful. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. What country, what city, what corner of the world are you in as you press play? I always find it incredible that while we sit together in one story, we're scattered across oceans, mountains, deserts, and skylines. So take a moment and let me know where you are, and if you enjoy slow, immersive storytelling designed to help you relax, unwind, and drift gently towards sleep. Consider subscribing. This channel is a quiet place for long-form historical and mythological journeys, stories told slowly, thoughtfully, and deeply. No rush, no noise, just time, atmosphere, and the steady rhythm of a voice guiding you through the past. Tonight, we begin one of the greatest legends ever told. A story of glory and fate, of friendship and fury, of a warrior who could not escape the destiny written for him before he was even born. Tonight's story is the full life of Achilles. We'll move slowly through his world, from prophecy and childhood to the battlefields of Troy, to the choices that shaped his name into legend. This will not be a rushed retelling. We will sit with the details, the emotions, the weight of each decision, the quiet moments between clashes of bronze and shield. So dim the lights. Settle into wherever you are most comfortable. Let the noise of the day drift a little farther away. And as we begin, imagine the sound of distant waves, the whisper of wind across ancient hills, and a world where gods still walked among men. This is the story of Achilles. Long before the ships of Greece ever touched the shores of Troy, before the walls of that city trembled beneath bronze and flame, the life of Achilles began with a prophecy whispered among the gods. The world into which Achilles would be born was a world still deeply shaped by divine will. The Olympian gods moved through the affairs of mortals like winds through the forests, unseen yet powerful enough to bend the course of kingdoms. Every birth among heroes carried weight, and some births carried fate. Achilles was destined to be one of those. His father was the mortal king Peleus, ruler of the Myrmidons in the region of Phthia in Greece. Peleus was a respected warrior and a man favored by the gods, but his fame would eventually be overshadowed by the son he helped bring into the world. His mother was far more extraordinary. She was Thetis, a sea goddess born among the daughters of the ancient sea god Nereus. Thetis possessed beauty that rivaled the dawn and power that flowed from the deepest waters of the world. For a time, the king of the gods himself desired her. Zeus had once considered taking Thetis as a lover, yet prophecy intervened. It was foretold that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father. For Zeus, such a prophecy was dangerous. He had once overthrown his own father, Cronus, and the memory of that violent succession remained a shadow over Olympus. Zeus had no intention of allowing the same fate to fall upon him. So instead of claiming Thetis, Zeus arranged for her to marry a mortal. That mortal was Peleus. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis became one of the most famous celebrations in myth. Gods, spirits, and legendary beings gathered to witness the union between divine and mortal. The mountains echoed with music. Rivers shimmered with reflected light from torches and divine presence. But even this joyous moment carried the seeds of disaster. Among all the gods invited to the wedding, one was intentionally left out: Eris. Eris did not take the insult quietly. At the height of the celebration, she cast a golden apple into the gathering of goddesses. Upon the apple were written the words, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately claimed the prize. They were Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Their argument would eventually lead to the judgment of a Trojan prince named Paris, and his decision would begin the chain of events that caused the Trojan War itself. Thus, even before Achilles was born, the circumstances surrounding his parents had already begun shaping the war he would one day fight. After the wedding, Thetis eventually gave birth to her son. Achilles entered the world beneath the shadow of prophecy. Different traditions tell different stories about what Thetis attempted to do for her child. Some ancient poets said she tried to make him immortal. Others said she tried to protect him from the fate she feared he could not escape. One of the most famous stories tells that Thetis carried her newborn son to the dark waters of the river Styx. The Styx was no ordinary river. Its waters flowed through the realm of the dead and carried ancient power older than the Olympian gods themselves. Anything touched by the Styx was changed forever. Holding her infant son tightly, Thetis dipped Achilles into the river so its divine waters would make him invulnerable. But as she lowered him into the water, she held him by his heel. That small part of his body remained untouched by the river's power. It would become the one vulnerable place on the body of the greatest warrior Greece would ever produce. Though later generations would remember this detail with the phrase Achilles' heel, the story itself reflects something deeper about the ancient Greek understanding of fate. Even the strongest hero could not escape destiny entirely, and Achilles' destiny was already unfolding. As the boy grew, Thetis watched him with increasing worry. The prophecy surrounding him became clearer with time. Achilles had 2 possible fates. He could live a long and quiet life, growing old far from the battlefield, forgotten by history, but surrounded by peace. Or he could travel to Troy and win eternal glory. But that glory would come at the cost of his life. The choice between these 2 destinies would shape every moment of Achilles' life. While still a child, Achilles was placed under the care of one of the wisest beings in Greek myth. His teacher was Chiron, a centaur, unlike the others of his kind. Chiron lived in the mountains and devoted his long life to training heroes. Many great warriors studied under him, including Heracles and Jason, but none would surpass Achilles. Under Chiron's guidance, the boy learned the arts that defined Greek heroism. He learned to run across rocky hills faster than the wind. He learned to throw the spear with deadly accuracy and draw the bow until its string sang like a harp. Yet Chiron did not train only his body. He also taught Achilles music, healing, philosophy, and the stories of the gods. The young hero learned to play the lyre and recite ancient tales. He learned the responsibilities of leadership and the meaning of honor. The Greeks believed that a true hero needed both strength and wisdom. Achilles possessed both. Even as a boy, he stood apart from others. His speed was unmatched. His strength seemed almost supernatural. When he ran across the hills of Mount Pelion, the wind itself seemed to chase him. Stories began to spread that he was faster than deer and stronger than lions. But the most important relationship of his youth was not with his teachers. It was with another boy. That boy was Patroclus. Patroclus had come to live with Peleus after a tragic accident forced him to leave his own home. Unlike Achilles, Patroclus was quieter and more reflective. Yet, the two formed a bond stronger than any brotherhood. They trained together, hunted together, and grew into warriors side by side. Patroclus admired Achilles' strength. Achilles trusted Patroclus's heart. Their friendship would one day become the emotional center of the Trojan War itself. As the boys grew into young men, rumors of a coming war began to spread across Greece. The cause was a woman. She was Helen, considered the most beautiful woman in the world. When she was taken to Troy by the prince Paris, Greek kings gathered their armies to bring her back. Among those kings was Agamemnon, ruler of Mycenae and commander of the united Greek armies. One by one, heroes answered the call to war: Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes. But the Greeks knew they needed something more. They needed Achilles. Prophecies had already declared that Troy could never fall without him. And so, as the winds of war began to stir across the Aegean Sea, messengers and kings started searching for the young hero whose destiny would shape the greatest war of myth. The boy raised among mountains and legends was about to enter the stage of history. And once Achilles stepped into that war, nothing in the world of gods or men would ever be the same. The prophecy never left Thetis. It followed her like the tide follows the moon, inescapable and constant. She had been told what her son would become. She had been told what it would cost him. And for all her divine nature, for all her ancient power drawn from the depths of the sea, she could not silence the future. Achilles was growing. Already, as he stood on the shores of Phthia watching the horizon, there was something in him that belonged to distance. His body moved with restless energy. His eyes lingered on ships passing along the coast. Even before war called his name, something within him leaned toward it. Thetis feared that pull. She had learned that the Greek kings were gathering after Paris of Troy carried Helen away from her husband Menelaus. The oath once sworn by Helen's former suitors was invoked. Years before, when Helen's hand had been sought by princes from across Greece, her father had made them swear that whoever she chose, the rest would defend that marriage if it were ever threatened. Now, that oath bound the most powerful warriors of Greece together. Menelaus called upon his brother, Agamemnon, and Agamemnon summoned kings and heroes from every corner of the Greek world. Messengers traveled across islands and mainland courts, speaking of honor, insult, and war. But among all the names spoken, one name carried unusual weight: Achilles. The seer Calchas had already declared that Troy would not fall without the son of Peleus. The Greeks needed him. Without him, the war would stretch endlessly. Thetis knew this, and so she did what mothers in myths often do when faced with destiny. She tried to hide her child from it. Some versions of the story say that she disguised Achilles as a girl and sent him to the island of Skyros. There, he would live among the daughters of King Lycomedes hidden in plain sight. Thetis hoped that if Achilles never joined the Greek fleet, perhaps the prophecy would dissolve. Perhaps he would live long. Perhaps the quiet life might become stronger than the call to glory. On Skyros, Achilles wore soft garments instead of armor. He lived among maidens instead of soldiers. His hair grew long. His name was spoken differently. Yet even disguised, he cannot erase who he was. There are details that ancient poets disagree on, but they agree on this. Greatness cannot be concealed easily. While living on Skyros, Achilles fathered a son with one of Lycomedes' daughters, Deidamia. The child would later be known as Neoptolemus. Even in hiding, the bloodline of warriors continued. But the Greeks were not fools. Among them was the most cunning mind of the age. Odysseus had no interest in letting prophecy slip through his fingers. He had tried to avoid the war himself, even pretending madness when first summoned, but his deception had been exposed. Now, bound by oath, he turned his cleverness toward another purpose. He was sent to find Achilles. Odysseus arrived at Skyros not as a warrior, but as a merchant. He brought with him gifts, fine cloth, jewelry, ornaments meant to entice royal daughters. But among those delicate offerings, he also placed something else: a shield, a spear, a finely crafted sword. As the young women gathered around the goods, admiring fabrics and gold, Odysseus gave a subtle signal. A horn sounded, the sharp, unmistakable note of alarm, a cry of attack. In that instant, one of the maidens did not shrink back in fear. One reached for the weapons. Without hesitation, Achilles seized the spear, instinct overriding disguise. The posture of his body shifted. The softness vanished. His eyes sharpened like a predator's. Odysseus smiled. The mask had fallen. There was no anger in Achilles when he realized he had been discovered. Instead, there was something closer to acceptance. He had known, perhaps unconsciously, that this concealment could not last forever. Thetis arrived too late. Whether she argued, pleaded, or simply stood in silent grief depends on the telling. But the truth remained unchanged. Achilles now knew of the prophecy in full clarity. He was given the choice: a long, obscure life, or a short life crowned with eternal fame. This moment is central to understanding Achilles. In later centuries, philosophers would debate the meaning of kleos, the Greek concept of glory that lives on after death. For the ancient Greeks, mortality was not merely an ending. It was a boundary that defined the intensity of life. Achilles understood that if he stayed behind, he would grow old, marry, rule quietly, and eventually fade into history. If he sailed to Troy, his name would never die. He chose Troy. This choice was not made lightly. It was not the reckless decision of a boy chasing battle. Achilles understood what death meant. He had been trained by Chiron. He knew suffering. He knew loss. But he also understood something else. To him, a life without greatness felt like a kind of living death. So he left Skyros. When Achilles joined the Greek forces, he did not come alone. He brought with him the Myrmidons, fierce warriors loyal to his father Peleus, and now to him. 50 ships carried them across the sea. They were disciplined, relentless fighters, and their loyalty to Achilles would prove unshakable. The gathering at Aulis was immense. Kings and warriors from across Greece assembled beneath snapping sails and creaking masts. Among them, stood figures who would become legends in their own right. Ajax the Great, towering and unbreakable in battle. Diomedes, bold and fierce. And of course, Agamemnon, whose authority bound them together, though not without tension. The sea did not immediately allow them passage. The winds stalled. According to tradition, the goddess Artemis was angered with Agamemnon, and the fleet remained trapped at Aulis without favorable wind. What followed was one of the darkest episodes of the Greek expedition. The sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter, to appease the goddess. Achilles was present during this delay. Some stories even suggest that Iphigenia was lured to Aulis under the pretense that she would marry Achilles, though he himself may not have known of the deception. If true, this would have been an early lesson in the cruelty of leadership and ambition. Eventually, the winds returned. The 1,000 ships set sail. As the coastline of Greece receded into the horizon, Achilles stood at the prow of his ship. The sea stretched endlessly before him. Somewhere beyond it lay Troy, a city he had never seen but which would define him forever. Patroclus stood beside him. There is something profoundly human in that image. 2 young men, bound by friendship, sailing toward a war that would either immortalize them or destroy them. The songs often focus on the battles, the duels, the rage. But in that quiet stretch of ocean, before the first spear was thrown, there must have been reflection. Achilles knew the shape of his fate now, and yet he did not turn back. The ships cut through the water. The wind filled their sails. Bronze armor glinted beneath the sun. Ahead lay 10 years of siege, blood, honor, and grief. Ahead lay Hector of Troy. Ahead lay the moment when Achilles' wrath would shake the foundations of gods and men. The boy hidden from fate had stepped willingly into it. And the world was about to learn what that choice truly meant. When the Greek fleet finally crossed the wide waters of the Aegean and the coastline of Asia Minor rose in the distance, the war that had been whispered about in courts and prophesied in sacred places began to take visible form. The sails, dark against the bright sky, seemed like a moving forest upon the sea. Hundreds of ships cut toward the same shore, carrying kings, champions, restless soldiers, and the weight of oath and pride. At their head stood the uneasy alliance commanded by Agamemnon. Though he was the High King, he did not command affection. He commanded obedience. There is a difference, and it would matter later. Among this vast gathering of warriors, there were men who had fought monsters, men who had crossed seas for glory, men who carried grudges, older than their armor, but none drew as many glances as Achilles. He was still young compared to many of the kings beside him, yet there was already something unsettling in his presence. It was not merely his strength, nor even the quiet confidence with which he carried himself. It was the sense that he belonged to something larger than the army itself. His mother was divine. His fate was known. His name had already begun to travel ahead of him. When the ships beached near Troy, confusion followed. An oracle had warned the Greeks that the first man to step upon Trojan soil would be the first to die. For a moment, the greatest warriors hesitated. It was a strange stillness. Thousands of armed men waiting for another to make the first move. In some traditions, it was Patroclus who leapt forward, striking the sand before anyone else. If so, prophecy proved swift and merciless. He was killed almost immediately by a Trojan spear, becoming the first casualty of a war that would consume countless lives. Whether Achilles was the very first to land or among the first wave depends on the version told, but he did not linger behind. Once battle began, hesitation left him entirely. The shore erupted into chaos, bronze clashing against bronze, shields splintering, men shouting prayers to gods who might or might not be listening. The Trojans, led by their noble defenders, met the invasion with fierce resistance. Among them stood Hector, son of King Priam, already a warrior of immense reputation. If Achilles was the brightest flame among the Greeks, Hector was the steadfast pillar of Troy. Yet, in those early encounters, Achilles did not meet Hector directly. Instead, he carved his own path through the outlying cities and allies of Troy. The war would not be decided in a single day, nor even in a single year. It became a siege, a grinding contest of endurance, raids, skirmishes, and shifting advantage. The Greeks established their camp along the shore, fortifying it with walls and trenches. Their ships were pulled onto the sand, their tents rising in long rows that faced the distant city walls of Troy. The Trojans remained largely behind their formidable defenses, supported by allies from across Anatolia and beyond. And so the war stretched outward, not only toward Troy itself, but toward the surrounding regions. In these campaigns, Achilles proved himself unstoppable. He led the Myrmidons with ruthless precision. City after city allied to Troy fell before him. Among the most significant of these raids was the capture of Lyrnessus and Thebe, towns connected to Trojan nobility. Achilles moved like a force of nature, swift, decisive, overwhelming. Ancient sources describe him as nearly untouchable. In combat, spears glanced away from him. Enemies faltered under the intensity of his assault. His speed became legendary. He seemed to close distance between himself and his opponent faster than thought. It was during one of these raids that Achilles encountered Aeneas, a prince destined for survival beyond the war. Their duel was fierce, but divine intervention prevented Aeneas from falling that day. Even here, the gods shaped outcomes. Mortals fought, but Olympus decided who would live to shape the next chapter of history. Another critical moment came with the death of Troilus. In some traditions, Achilles ambushed and killed Troilus while he was still young, perhaps even within the sanctuary of a temple. A prophecy had said that Troy would not fall if Troilus reached adulthood. If this story is accurate, then Achilles had already struck a fatal blow to Troy's future, long before its walls would crumble. But these victories came at a cost. War has a rhythm, and its rhythm grinds the soul. The siege dragged on year after year. The Greeks could not breach Troy's massive walls. The Trojans could not drive the invaders fully into the sea. Skirmishes filled the days. Funeral pyres filled the nights. Achilles continued to gather honor, spoils, and reputation. Among the captives taken in these campaigns was Briseis, awarded to him as a prize of war. In the ancient world, such prizes symbolized status and achievement. They were tokens of a warrior's success, grim reminders of victory. But beneath the surface of triumph, tension simmered. Agamemnon, as commander, expected obedience. Yet he led men who were kings in their own lands. Pride walked beside every throne and every spear, One of the earliest signs of fracture came when Agamemnon himself was forced to return his own captive, Chryseis, to appease the god Apollo, who had sent plague upon the Greek camp. The priest Chryses had begged for his daughter's return. Agamemnon had refused. Apollo answered with disease. For days the Greek camp suffered. Soldiers fell not from spears, but from fever. Smoke from funeral pyres hung constantly in the air. Finally, under pressure, Agamemnon agreed to return Chryseis. But he did not accept the loss quietly. Instead, he demanded compensation. And his gaze fell upon Achilles. In this demand lay the seed of catastrophe. Before that confrontation erupted fully, there was still a sense that the war might eventually break in the Greeks' favor through sheer dominance. Achilles' campaigns had weakened Troy's allies. His name alone inspired fear among enemy ranks, yet even he could not storm the city walls alone. And so the stalemate persisted. During these years, Achilles and Patroclus remained inseparable. They shared counsel, laughter in rare, quiet evenings, and unspoken understanding. Patroclus often tempered Achilles' sharper impulses. Where Achilles burned bright and fierce, Patroclus moved with steadier warmth. It is important to understand this balance. Achilles was not a simple brute of violence. He played the lyre in his tent. He sang of heroes past. He reflected on mortality and glory. He could be generous, even gentle. But he also possessed a pride that matched his power. The Greeks measured a man's worth by honor, time, and reputation, kleos. To strip a warrior of honor publicly was not merely insult. It was a wound deeper than steel. As the 10th year of the war approached, that wound would be inflicted. And when it was, Achilles would step away from battle. The greatest warrior in the Greek army would withdraw his strength. The Trojans would surge. Men who had once depended on Achilles' invincibility would taste fear. And the wrath that had been whispered about in prophecy would finally awaken. For now, though, the war remained balanced on a blade's edge. The sea crashed against the shore beside the Greek camp. Troy's walls stood firm in the distance. Smoke from cook fires and funeral pyres mingled beneath the same sky. Achilles stood at the height of his power, unbeaten, unchallenged, unaware that the greatest battles of his life would not begin with Hector's spear, but with an insult from his own king. By the time the 10th year of the war approached, the Greek camp had become a world of its own. What had once been an invasion force had turned into a rough and restless city of wood, canvas, bronze, and bone. The ships lay pulled high upon the sand, their hulls weathered by salt and sun. Between them rose long rows of tents. Cooking fires smoked day and night. The sound of hammer striking metal never truly ceased. Armor was repaired. Spears were reshaped. Shields were patched. War had become routine. But routine does not mean peace. The air itself seemed tense. Victory had not come. Troy still stood beyond its towering walls. The Greeks had won countless skirmishes, burned allied towns, gathered treasure and captives. But the heart of their purpose remained untouched. It was into this atmosphere of frustration and pride that the quarrel erupted. The crisis began not with Achilles, but with a father. Chryses, a priest of Apollo, came to the Greek camp carrying ransom for his daughter, Chryseis. She had been taken captive during one of the raids and awarded to Agamemnon. The priest did not come with threats. He came humbly, bearing sacred tokens and invoking the god he served. Most of the Greek soldiers respected the plea. Even hardened warriors understood the power of gods. But Agamemnon refused him harshly. He dismissed the old man publicly, humiliated him, ordered him away. In doing so, Agamemnon did not simply insult a father. He insulted Apollo. The god answered swiftly. A plague descended upon the Greek camp. At first, it struck the animals. Mules and dogs began to die. Then men followed. Fever swept through the tents. Bodies were carried to funeral pyres in endless procession. Smoke thickened the air. The smell of burning flesh became constant. For 9 days, the plague raged. On the 10th day, Achilles called an assembly. This detail matters deeply. It was not Agamemnon who summoned the leaders. It was Achilles. The greatest warrior stepped forward, not with a spear, but with a demand for clarity. His concern was not merely pride. It was survival. He urged that a prophet be consulted to determine why Apollo had turned against them. The seer Calchas, trembling but resolute, revealed the truth. The plague would not end until Chryseis was returned to her father without ransom. Agamemnon was furious. He agreed to give the girl back, but not without compensation. He insisted that he must not be left without a prize while others retained theirs. His eyes turned toward Achilles. In that moment, something shifted. Achilles had earned Briseis through conquest. She was not merely a captive. She represented recognition of his strength and status. To take her from him publicly was to strip him of honor. The argument escalated quickly. Words sharpened. Voices rose. Agamemnon accused Achilles of arrogance and insubordination. Achilles accused Agamemnon of greed and cowardice, of staying behind the lines while others fought and bled. The assembly watched in silence. Here stood the two most powerful figures in the Greek force, clashing not with swords, but with pride. At the height of the argument, Achilles' hand moved toward his weapon. He considered killing Agamemnon where he stood. This was no empty threat. Achilles possessed the strength to attempt it, and in that instant, rage consumed him so completely that he nearly acted. But the goddess Athena intervened. Visible only to Achilles, she seized him by the hair and counseled restraint. She promised that greater compensation would come if he endured the insult. Achilles obeyed. Yet obedience did not mean forgiveness. Agamemnon sent men to seize Briseis from Achilles' tent. The Myrmidons did not resist. Achilles ordered them to stand down. But the humiliation was complete. Briseis was led away under guard, and Achilles withdrew. He declared that he would no longer fight for Agamemnon. Let the king defend his own honor. Let the Greeks see how they fared without him. This was not a small act. Achilles was the most formidable warrior in the army. His absence was not symbolic. It was catastrophic. He retreated to his ships and sat beside the sea. There, he called upon his mother. Thetis rose from the water to hear her son's grief and fury. Achilles did not weep for Briseis alone. He wept for the insult, for the injustice, for the sense that his life was being spent for a leader who did not respect him. Thetis listened, and she made a dangerous promise. She would go to Olympus and ask Zeus to honor Achilles by allowing the Trojans to gain the upper hand, so that the Greeks would realize how desperately they needed him. It was a mother's response. If her son's honor had been wounded, then the world would feel the cost. Zeus agreed. From that moment, the balance of war began to tilt. Without Achilles on the battlefield, the Greeks lost their sharpest blade. Hector and the Trojan forces surged forward with renewed strength. Confidence rose within Troy's walls. For the first time in years, hope seemed real. The Greeks faltered. They were driven back toward their ships. Defensive walls were tested. Fires threatened to reach the hulls that represented their only escape. Warriors who had once stood proudly now fought desperately. Ajax held the line again and again, towering and relentless, but even he could not compensate entirely for Achilles' absence. Diomedes fought bravely. Odysseus maneuvered skillfully. Yet something was missing. The Greeks began to understand the truth of prophecy. They needed Achilles. Inside his tent, Achilles listened to the sounds of battle from afar. This is one of the most haunting images in the entire epic tradition. The greatest warrior alive sat apart while his comrades bled. His lyre rested beside him. His armor remained unused. Was he right? Was his honor worth the suffering of his allies? These are questions that have echoed for centuries. Achilles believed that a man without honor was nothing. If he allowed Agamemnon's insult to stand unchallenged, then all his sacrifices meant little. Yet every cry from the battlefield pressed against his resolve. Eventually, Agamemnon recognized the disaster he had caused. He sent an embassy to Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, the old tutor who had once helped raise him. They brought gifts, treasure, apologies, the promise of returning Briseis untouched. They appealed to friendship, to shared history, to glory. Achilles listened. He did not shout. He did not rage. He spoke quietly. He reminded them that he had been given a choice between long life and short glory. Why should he die for a man who had dishonored him? Why should he bleed for someone who treated him as expendable? He declared that he was considering returning home. The embassy failed, and so the war worsened. The Trojans pushed the Greeks back to the very edge of destruction. The ships, the lifeline to Greece, were nearly set ablaze. It was at this desperate hour that Patroclus approached Achilles. He had watched the suffering. He had felt the despair in the camp, and he could no longer remain passive. Patroclus did not accuse Achilles. He did not belittle him. He asked for permission. Permission to wear Achilles' armor. Permission to lead the Myrmidons into battle in his place. The sight of Achilles' armor on the field might terrify the Trojans and turn the tide, even if Achilles himself refused to fight. Achilles hesitated, but at last he agreed. He gave Patroclus his armor. He gave him the Myrmidons, but he gave him strict instructions. Drive the Trojans back from the ships, then return. Do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Patroclus nodded and stepped into fate. Achilles watched as his dearest companion rode into battle wearing his armor, the armor that symbolized his identity, the armor that marked him as invincible. He could not know that he was watching the beginning of the end. For once, Achilles had withdrawn from battle. The world had begun to unravel. And soon, the cost of pride, both his own and Agamemnon's, would be measured not in wounded honor, but in death. When Patroclus stepped into Achilles' armor, the act was far more than a tactical decision. It was a crossing of identity, a blurring of fate. The bronze plates that had been shaped to fit Achilles' powerful frame gleamed in the harsh light of the battlefield. The crest of the helmet shimmered. The shield caught the sun. From a distance, no Trojan eye could distinguish the difference. And that was the point. The Myrmidons, long held back in simmering frustration, surged forward behind him. They had watched their fellow Greeks falter. They had endured the insult to their lord. Now they were unleashed. Achilles remained by the ships. That detail matters. He stood at the threshold between action and inaction, between pride and responsibility. He had allowed this compromise. His armor, his men, but not himself. It was as though he believed he could bend fate slightly without stepping into it fully. But fate does not bend. It waits. As Patroclus charged into battle, the Trojans recoiled in shock. Word spread like fire through dry grass. Achilles has returned. Fear moved faster than spears. For years, the name Achilles had been synonymous with devastation. Trojan mothers had whispered it in fear. Soldiers had felt their courage weaken at its mention. Now, seeing what they believed to be Achilles himself, they faltered. The momentum of the battle shifted almost instantly. Patroclus fought with fierce determination. Though not the equal of Achilles in raw power, he was still a formidable warrior. He cut down enemies with controlled fury. The Myrmidons followed him with disciplined aggression. The Greeks, seeing Achilles' armor at the front lines, rallied behind the surge. The Trojans were driven back from the ships. Flames that had threatened to consume the Greek fleet were extinguished. The shoreline, once moments from catastrophe, filled again with the sound of advancing Greek shields. Patroclus could have returned then. Achilles' command had been clear. Drive them back. Save the ships. Do not pursue. But victory intoxicates. The tide had turned so dramatically that restraint began to feel like cowardice. The Trojans were retreating. Their lines were breaking. The gates of Troy were in sight, and somewhere in that storm of dust and bronze, Patroclus crossed an invisible boundary. He pursued. Some ancient sources suggest that divine influence nudged events forward. The god Apollo, protector of Troy, is said to have intervened directly. Others emphasize human overreach. Perhaps it was both. In the world of myth, gods and human impulses intertwine so tightly that separation becomes meaningless. Patroclus pressed onward. He killed many. Among them was Sarpedon, son of Zeus and ally of Troy. The fall of Sarpedon was significant. Even the king of the gods felt the pull of grief. Yet Zeus allowed fate to unfold. The death of his son signaled that this battle had crossed into deeper territory. The Trojans fell back toward their walls. Patroclus chased glory. 3 times he attacked the defenses near the Scaean Gate. 3 times he was driven back, not by mortal strength alone, but by divine resistance. Apollo struck him from behind, disorienting him. His helmet fell from his head. The great armor of Achilles shifted upon him, as if rejecting the wearer. In that moment of vulnerability, the illusion shattered. Patroclus was exposed. The Trojan warrior Euphorbus struck first, wounding him. Then came Hector. Hector had endured years of war, years of watching his city besieged. He had faced countless Greek champions, but this moment, this confrontation, would define him as much as Achilles. Hector drove his spear into Patroclus. The blow was fatal. As Patroclus fell, the armor of Achilles gleamed under the sun. Stained with dust and blood, Hector stood over him, unaware of the full weight of what had just occurred. With his dying breath, Patroclus spoke. He revealed that Hector had not slain Achilles, and he warned that Achilles himself would soon bring death upon Hector. Then he died. Silence did not fall upon the battlefield. Battle never pauses for grief. But something changed in the air. The armor that Hector stripped from Patroclus was more than a trophy. It was a symbol. Hector believed he had killed Achilles. He wore the armor proudly. But when news reached the Greek camp, the truth landed like a thunderbolt. Achilles had not fought. Patroclus had died in his place. The messenger arrived breathless. Achilles listened. For a moment, he did not understand. The words seemed impossible. Patroclus, steady and loyal, who had stood beside him since youth, who had shared training under Chiron, who had followed him into exile and into war, gone? When comprehension settled, it did not manifest as quiet sorrow. It erupted. Achilles cried out in anguish so fierce that even his mother heard him from the depths of the sea. He fell to the ground. He poured dust over his head. He tore at his hair. This was not the controlled anger of wounded pride. This was devastation. For all the arguments about honor and insult, Achilles' withdrawal had always been framed as a matter of principle. But now the cost was no longer abstract. It had a name: Patroclus. In that instant, Achilles understood something terrible. His pride had contributed to this. If he had returned to battle earlier, Patroclus would not have worn the armor. Patroclus would not have chased the Trojans to the walls. Patroclus would still be alive. This realization cut deeper than Agamemnon's insult ever had. Thetis rose again to comfort her son. She found him broken in a way she'd never seen before. He did not speak of honor now. He did not speak of Agamemnon. He spoke only of revenge. He would kill Hector. He knew what that meant. The prophecy returned with cruel clarity. If Achilles killed Hector, his own death would follow soon after. But the choice that had once seemed balanced between long life and short glory was no longer balanced at all. Without Patroclus, the long life held no appeal. Achilles chose vengeance. Yet there was a practical problem. Hector now wore Achilles' armor. The armor crafted by the god Hephaestus himself, the armor that had protected Achilles through countless battles, was lost. Achilles would need new armor. Thetis went to Olympus once more and pleaded with Hephaestus, the divine smith. Moved by her grief, he forged a new set unlike any before it. The shield alone was a masterpiece, depicting the cosmos, cities at peace and war, fields of harvest, dances, stars, and the encircling ocean. It was not merely armor. It was a vision of the world Achilles would defend and destroy. As Hephaestus hammered bronze that glowed like sunrise, Achilles remained beside Patroclus's body. He refused food. He refused rest. Grief hardened into something cold and unstoppable. The Greeks, who had begged for his return before, now watched him with awe and fear. The warrior who had once withdrawn in pride was returning in wrath, and this wrath would not be contained. When Achilles finally emerged in his new armor, it shone with unnatural brilliance. The mere sight of him sent tremors through the Trojan ranks. Even Hector, felt the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest. The boy, hidden on Skyros. The warrior who had withdrawn in anger. The friend who had lost his closest companion. All of these versions of Achilles converged into one figure. A man who no longer cared for his own survival. A man who had nothing left to lose. The battlefield awaited, and Hector, standing before the walls of Troy, did not yet fully grasp that he was about to face not merely a warrior, but the embodiment of grief sharpened into a spear. When Achilles returned to battle, the world seemed to recoil. There are moments in myth where a single human being appears to cross the boundary between mortal and elemental force. Achilles, clad in the new armor forged by Hephaestus, became something more than a man in the eyes of both armies. The bronze did not merely protect him, it radiated. The shield shimmered with scenes of the cosmos itself, cities thriving, cities burning, constellations wheeling above, the ocean encircling all life. It was as though Achilles carried the entire world upon his arm. But inside that armor, there was no balance. Only grief. Only fury. Before he even reached the battlefield, his voice rang out across the plain. The cry was so piercing that some accounts say it sent Trojan soldiers stumbling backward in fear. Athena stood beside him unseen, amplifying the terror of his presence. Dust lifted in spirals around his feet. The horses of Troy trembled. Hector heard the cry from within the city gates. For a brief moment, even he felt the shadow of doubt. Yet Hector did not retreat into Troy immediately. He was not a coward, nor was he reckless. He understood the weight of his responsibility. He was not fighting for personal honor alone. He fought for his father Priam, for his wife Andromache, for his son Astyanax, and for the countless lives behind the city walls. The war had always been personal for Achilles. For Hector, it was communal. As Achilles advanced, the Trojans began to fall in numbers that stunned even seasoned observers. He did not fight strategically. He did not conserve strength. He moved through the battlefield like a storm tearing through dry forest. He cut down men who had once stood proudly in formation. He chased those who fled. He showed no mercy. The river Scamander itself, swollen with corpses, became a symbol of the carnage. Achilles drove Trojan warriors into its waters and slaughtered them there. The river, personified in myth as a god, grew enraged at the pollution of its current. According to the epic tradition, Scamander rose against Achilles, swelling its waters to drown him in retaliation for the bloodshed. It is a striking image. Nature itself resisting his excess. For a moment, Achilles struggled, not against a mortal foe, but against a rising tide. Yet divine intervention came again. The gods quarreled above, each favoring different sides. Hera and Athena supported the Greeks. Apollo and others aided the Trojans. Even on Olympus, conflict mirrored the chaos below. Eventually, Achilles escaped the river's grasp, but something important had been revealed. His wrath was no longer measured. It was boundless. He sought Hector not as a rival, but as the focal point of his pain. Every fallen Trojan was merely an obstacle between himself and that single encounter. When Achilles finally approached the walls of Troy, Hector stood outside. For a moment, the two greatest warriors of the age faced one another across open ground. Behind Hector rose the massive gates of Troy. Priam watched from the walls, pleading with his son to come inside. Andromache, too, begged for caution. They understood what was at stake. Hector hesitated. It was not fear alone. It was calculation. Could he truly defeat Achilles now, driven by vengeance and clad in divine armor? When Achilles began to close the distance, Hector's resolve faltered. He turned and ran. The image of Hector fleeing has troubled audiences for centuries, yet it must be understood in context. He was not abandoning battle entirely. He was seeking position, time, perhaps an opportunity. The two warriors circled the city 3 times, a grim chase beneath the gaze of gods and mortals alike. Achilles gained ground steadily. At last, Athena intervened again, deceiving Hector by appearing in the form of his brother Deiphobus. Believing he was no longer alone, Hector stopped running and turned to fight. The duel that followed was swift and brutal. Hector threw his spear first. It struck Achilles' shield, but failed to penetrate. He called for Deiphobus to provide another weapon, only to realize he had been tricked. He stood alone. Achilles advanced. He aimed not blindly, but precisely. Guided by Athena, he struck at the small gap near Hector's collarbone, where the armor did not fully protect him. The spear pierced. Hector fell. As he lay dying, he begged Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial. In ancient Greek culture, burial rites were sacred. To deny them was to prolong suffering beyond death. Achilles refused. His grief had not softened into mercy. He declared that he wished he could devour Hector's flesh raw for what he had done to Patroclus. Then Hector died. But Achilles' wrath did not end with the killing blow. He pierced Hector's ankles and tied the body to his chariot. Before the horrified eyes of the Trojans upon the walls, Achilles dragged Hector's corpse through the dust. This act crossed a boundary. Even in war, there were codes. Even enemies recognized certain limits. Achilles, once admired for nobility as well as strength, now seemed transformed into something darker. He dragged the body back to the Greek camp and continued the desecration daily, circling Patroclus' tomb with Hector's corpse trailing behind his chariot. And yet, here is the quiet, haunting detail. The gods preserved Hector's body from decay. Apollo shielded it from corruption. The brutality could not erase dignity entirely. Days passed. Patroclus was finally given proper funeral rites. Achilles cut his hair in mourning. He sacrificed animals, and, in some accounts, even Trojan captives, upon the pyre. The flames rose high into the night, but after the fire died down, Achilles' anger remained. It had lost its immediate target, yet it had not found peace. Then, one night, something extraordinary happened. An old man entered the Greek camp unnoticed. It was Priam, king of Troy. Guided by Hermes and driven by unimaginable courage, Priam came to the tent of the man who had killed and desecrated his son. He knelt before Achilles. He kissed the hands that had slain Hector, and he begged. He did not speak as a king demanding justice. He spoke as a father. He reminded Achilles of Peleus, his own father, growing old in distant Phthia. He asked Achilles to imagine the grief Peleus would feel if his son never returned. In that moment, something shifted. Achilles saw not an enemy, but a reflection. 2 fathers, 2 sons, 2 lives entangled in the same tragedy. For the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles wept, not in rage, but in shared sorrow. He lifted Priam gently. He agreed to return Hector's body. The desecration ended. A truce was granted for the funeral. This scene stands as one of the most powerful in all ancient literature. It reveals that even within the fiercest warrior, humanity can re-emerge. Achilles had descended into wrath so profound it threatened to erase him. Yet, in the face of Priam's humility, he remembered what it meant to be human. Still, the prophecy had not changed. Achilles had killed Hector, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. The war would continue. Troy still stood, but the clock had begun to run out for the greatest warrior the Greeks had ever known. His glory was now undeniable. His name would echo through centuries, and yet, as he sat beside the old king in his tent, sharing food in fragile peace, the shadow of his own approaching death stretched longer than ever before. After Hector's body was returned, and the funeral rites were completed within the walls of Troy, a strange stillness settled over the war. For a brief span of days, grief replaced fury. The Trojans mourned their greatest defender. The Greeks, too, felt the weight of what had transpired. Even Achilles, whose wrath had burned so violently, seemed quieter. But war does not pause for long. Hector's death did not end the conflict. It removed Troy's strongest shield, but it did not tear down the walls. And with Hector gone, new figures rose to fill the vacuum. Allies from distant lands arrived to support the besieged city, drawn by loyalty, by duty, or by the promise of glory. Among them came the Amazon queen Penthesilea. Her arrival was like the arrival of a new storm. The Amazons were legendary, warrior women from lands beyond the familiar Greek world, fierce riders and archers whose skill matched any man's. Penthesilea herself was said to be both beautiful and terrible in battle. She carried a spear with lethal precision and fought not with hesitation, but with relentless courage. When she rode onto the battlefield, Troy felt a surge of hope. Achilles met her in combat. Some later traditions embellish the encounter with tragic undertones. They say that when Achilles struck her down and removed her helmet, he was momentarily struck by her beauty and nobility, even as life faded from her eyes. If this version holds truth, it adds yet another layer to the complexity of Achilles' character. He was capable of destruction without limit, yet not entirely devoid of recognition or reflection. Penthesilea fell, and with her death, another wave of Troy's support dissolved. But she was not the last. Soon after came Memnon, son of Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Memnon was no minor figure. He was a warrior of immense strength, armored in black, commanding forces from the distant south. His arrival once again rekindled Trojan confidence. Memnon's duel with Achilles echoed the earlier clash with Hector. It was a meeting of champions, watched by gods and mortals alike. Memnon fought fiercely. In some traditions, Zeus himself weighed the fates of both men upon golden scales. The balance tipped toward Achilles. Memnon fell. Eos, the dawn goddess, wept for her son, just as Thetis would soon weep for hers. Each victory for Achilles brought him closer to the fulfillment of his own prophecy. He seemed unstoppable, yet something subtle had changed since the death of Hector. Achilles still fought with unmatched ferocity, but his wrath had cooled into something more fatalistic. He no longer burned with chaotic rage. Instead, he moved with grim inevitability. He knew his death was approaching, and still he fought. The Trojans had lost Hector. They had lost Penthesilea. They had lost Memnon. Their strength waned, but their walls remained unbroken. The city itself stood as defiance. Within those walls lived Paris, the very man whose actions had ignited the war. Paris was not Hector. He lacked his brother's discipline and moral gravity. Yet he was not without skill. He was a capable archer, favored by Aphrodite, who had long protected him. Paris had watched Achilles slaughter Troy's greatest defenders. He understood what many others now knew. Achilles had to die. According to tradition, Achilles' final days were marked by a sense of looming destiny. Some stories say he fell in love with Polyxena, a Trojan princess and daughter of Priam, and that negotiations or meetings near the walls created vulnerability. Other versions focus purely on battlefield circumstances. What remains consistent across most accounts is this: Achilles was struck not in open duel, but from a distance. The moment came near the Scaean Gate, the same place where Hector had made his final stand. Achilles was pressing the Trojans hard, driving them back yet again. His new armor shone brilliantly. His shield caught the sunlight. He seemed almost untouchable. Then Paris drew his bow, a single arrow, but not merely guided by human aim. Many traditions insist that Apollo himself directed its flight. The arrow flew across the battlefield, and it struck Achilles in the one place unprotected, his heel. The vulnerability left untouched when his mother had dipped him into the waters of the river Styx. The small, human imperfection in an otherwise near invincible body. The arrow pierced. Pain, sharp and immediate, cut through him. Not the kind of wound he had shrugged off countless times before. This was different. The prophecy unfolded. Some say he tried to remove the arrow. Some say he continued to fight briefly despite the injury. Others suggest he fell quickly. But all agree on the end. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, fell upon the plain of Troy. The battlefield froze in disbelief. The Trojans could scarcely comprehend what had occurred. The Greeks reacted with panic and fury. To lose Achilles was not merely to lose a soldier. It was to lose the living embodiment of their strength. A fierce struggle erupted over his body. The Greeks would not allow it to be claimed by the enemy. Ajax the Great played a crucial role in defending Achilles' fallen form, holding back Trojan forces long enough for it to be retrieved. His body was carried back to the ships. Thetis rose once more from the sea, but this time there was no promise to seek, no revenge to demand, only mourning. She had known this day would come from the moment of his birth. She had tried to prevent it. She had hidden him. She had armed him with divine protection. But fate, once chosen, cannot be undone. Achilles was given funeral rites worthy of his stature. The pyre burned high, its flames visible across the shoreline. The Myrmidons cut their hair in grief. The army that had once relied on his strength now stood in stunned silence. Patroclus's ashes were said to be mingled with his own. honoring the bond that had defined much of his life. And so ended the life of Achilles, but not his story. Because in the ancient Greek world, death was not the end of meaning. Achilles had chosen short life and eternal glory. He had achieved it. His name would be sung in epic poetry for millennia. His wrath would open the greatest of ancient epics. His humanity, his pride, his grief, his love, his fury would continue to resonate long after Troy itself fell into ruin. The war was not yet over. The wooden horse had not yet entered the gates. The city had not yet burned. But something essential had shifted. With Achilles gone, the Greeks had lost their brightest flame, and Troy, though wounded and diminished, had survived the storm of the greatest warrior the world had ever known. The boy hidden from fate had met it head-on. The hero who chose glory had paid its price, and in doing so, he became something more enduring than life. A legend carried across centuries, whispered in the rhythm of waves against distant shores. When Achilles died, something in the Greek camp seemed to dim. For nearly a decade, his presence had been both weapon and reassurance. Even during his withdrawal from battle, the very possibility of his return had held meaning. Now that possibility was gone. The pyre that consumed his body burned through the night, its flames rising high against the dark horizon of the Trojan plain. The sea reflected the fire in trembling streaks of orange and gold, as if even the waters mourned the son of Thetis. His funeral was not a quiet affair. The Greeks honored him with games, chariot races, wrestling matches, contests of spear and strength, just as Patroclus had been honored before him. These funeral games were more than ceremony. They were a reaffirmation of heroic values. Even in death, Achilles inspired competition, excellence, and the relentless pursuit of glory. Yet beneath the ritual and competition lay tension. Achilles' armor, newly forged by Hephaestus, remained. It had not been taken by the Trojans. It had been recovered along with his body. That armor was no ordinary prize. It was divine craftsmanship, unmatched in beauty and protection. But more than that, it symbolized succession. Who would inherit the legacy of Achilles? Two names emerged: Ajax the Great, the towering bulwark of Greek defense, who had helped carry Achilles' body from the field, believed his deeds justified the claim, and Odysseus, cunning and eloquent, who had contributed not only through strength, but through strategy and intellect, also put himself forward. The dispute did not erupt into immediate violence. Instead, it was resolved through judgment, either by the assembled Greek leaders or, in some traditions, by Trojan captives who were asked to name which hero they feared most. The armor was awarded to Odysseus. For Ajax, this was devastation. Ajax had always embodied physical might, steadfast courage, and directness. He had stood firm where others wavered. To lose the armor of Achilles, an emblem of warrior supremacy, to a man defined more by cleverness than brute strength, was more than humiliation. It was an existential blow. In the darkness of wounded pride, Ajax unraveled. Driven by fury and shame, he planned to kill the Greek leaders who had denied him, but Athena clouded his mind, and in his madness, he slaughtered livestock instead, believing them to be his enemies. When clarity returned and he realized what he had done, the shame was unbearable. Ajax took his own life. another great pillar of the Greek force fell, not to Trojan spears, but to the crushing weight of honor and humiliation. The deaths of Achilles and Ajax left the Greek army changed. Their greatest warrior was gone. Their strongest defender had perished by his own hand. The war could not continue in the same way. It required transformation. And transformation came in unexpected forms. A prophecy declared that Troy could not fall without the bow of Heracles. That bow belonged to Philoctetes, who had been abandoned years earlier on the island of Lemnos due to a festering wound that emitted an unbearable stench. Now, the Greeks needed him. Odysseus, ever the strategist, played a role in retrieving Philoctetes, though the wounded archer had every reason to resent those who had left him behind. He ultimately agreed to return. It was Philoctetes who would later wound Paris with a poisoned arrow, an ironic symmetry to Achilles' own death. Yet even this was not enough to breach Troy's walls. Another prophecy surfaced. The son of Achilles must fight. On the island of Skyros lived Neoptolemus, born of Diademia during Achilles' hidden years. Still young, but bearing his father's blood, Neoptolemus was brought to Troy. He did not hesitate to embrace his inheritance. In many accounts, he proved fierce, perhaps even more merciless than Achilles. Where Achilles had combined wrath with moments of humanity, Neoptolemus often acted with colder brutality. With the arrival of Philoctetes and Neoptolemus, the Greeks fulfilled the final prophecies required for Troy's fall. But brute force would not bring victory. The walls still stood. The war had lasted nearly 10 years, and so Odysseus conceived a plan that would define cunning for all ages. The Greeks would not storm Troy. They would enter it. A massive wooden horse was constructed, large enough to conceal selected warriors within its hollow body. The rest of the Greek army would pretend to abandon the shore, sailing out of sight, but remaining hidden nearby. The horse would be left behind as an offering, a supposed token of surrender. Despite warnings from some Trojans, including the priest Laocoon, who famously urged his people to beware of Greeks bearing gifts, the horse was brought inside the city walls. That night, as Troy celebrated what it believed to be victory, the hidden warriors emerged. They opened the gates. The Greek army returned under cover of darkness. What followed was not a battle. It was annihilation. The city that had stood for a decade under siege burned. King Priam was killed at his own altar by Neoptolemus. Andromache was taken captive. Astyanax, Hector's young son, was thrown from the walls in an act of ruthless finality. Flames consumed the temples. Statues toppled. Screams replaced songs. The Trojan War ended not with a noble duel, but with smoke and ruin. And yet, Achilles did not see it. The fall of Troy occurred after his death. He had been essential to the weakening of the city. He had slain Hector, the greatest defender. He had shattered morale and eliminated allies. But he did not witness the final victory. There's something profoundly fitting in that. Achilles chose glory over longevity. He sought eternal fame rather than quiet survival. He achieved what he desired, but he did not live to see the culmination of the war he shaped. His story, in many ways, is larger than the war itself. In the centuries that followed, poets would sing of him. Most famously, the epic known as the Iliad, attributed to Homer, would immortalize not the entire war, but a brief span centered on his wrath. The poem does not narrate the fall of Troy. It does not detail the wooden horse. It focuses instead on Achilles' anger, his grief, and his confrontation with Hector. Why? Because Achilles is not merely a warrior. He is a study of humanity intensified. He embodies the tension between pride and compassion, between glory and life, between mortality and memory. He stands as the ultimate expression of the heroic code and its cost. In some later traditions, when Odysseus journeys to the underworld, he encounters the spirit of Achilles. There, Achilles reportedly tells him that he would rather be a living servant than a dead king among the shades. If true, it casts a shadow over the choice he made. But even that reflection does not erase what he achieved. His name has endured for over 2 millennia. His heel has become a metaphor across languages. His story continues to be told in quiet rooms beneath dim lights, long after the real city of Troy crumbled into dust. Achilles lived briefly. He burned brightly. And in that brightness, he secured the only immortality mortals can truly claim: remembrance. After Troy fell and its walls were reduced to ash and memory, the survivors of the Greek army began the long journey home. Ships that had once carried ambition now carried ghosts. Victory did not feel as triumphant as it had once been imagined. Too many heroes were gone. Among the fallen, Achilles stood apart. Even in death, he dominated the imagination of those who had known him. The ashes of Achilles, mingled with those of Patroclus, were said to have been placed in a single golden urn. That detail is not small. It reflects the depth of their bond. In life, they had trained, fought, and endured together. In death, they were not separated. The burial mound raised for Achilles near the Hellespont became a landmark. Sailors passing through those waters in later generations would point toward it and speak his name. The physical tomb anchored his story to the earth, but the true monument to Achilles was less visible. It was song. The ancient Greeks did not measure immortality through monuments alone. They measured it through memory carried in poetry. A hero's life achieved its fullest meaning when it became story, when bards recited his deeds before kings and villagers alike. And no hero received more enduring song than Achilles. The epic known as the Iliad, attributed to Homer, does not attempt to tell the entire Trojan War. Instead, it begins with a single word: wrath. The wrath of Achilles. That choice is revealing. The defining feature of Achilles in literature is not merely his strength, nor even his victories. It is his emotional intensity. His anger shapes the fate of armies. His grief reshapes his identity. His compassion in the encounter with Priam restores a fragile humanity. Achilles becomes the lens through which war itself is examined. He is not a flawless champion. He is proud, volatile, capable of cruelty, yet he is also capable of deep loyalty, profound love, and self-awareness. His choice between long life and short glory encapsulates one of the central dilemmas of human existence: whether to seek safety or significance. Later, Greek thinkers reflected on him with complexity. In some traditions, when Odysseus journeys to the underworld during his long voyage home, he encounters Achilles among the shades of the dead. Odysseus praises him, saying that in life he was honored like a god, and in death he rules among the departed. Achilles' reply is sobering. He tells Odysseus that he would rather live as a hired servant among the living than reign as king among the dead. If this exchange is taken seriously, it complicates the heroic ideal. Achilles, who chose glory over longevity, seems to acknowledge the cost of that choice. But this reflection does not erase his legacy. Instead, it deepens it, because Achilles becomes not merely a symbol of martial excellence, but a symbol of human contradiction. He embodies the tension between the desire for everlasting fame and the simple, irreplaceable value of being alive. As centuries passed, his story traveled beyond Greece. The Romans inherited and adapted the Trojan narrative. Through the figure of Aeneas, who survived Troy and journeyed west, the war became foundational to Roman identity. Achilles, though an enemy within that tradition, remained central. His greatness could not be diminished without diminishing the scale of those who opposed him. Artists painted him. Playwrights reimagined him. Philosophers debated him. He became a model for warriors, a cautionary tale for leaders, and a psychological study for poets. The phrase Achilles' heel entered language as a metaphor for vulnerability, hidden within strength. It speaks to the paradox of his near invincibility, undone by a single unprotected point. The image endures because it captures something universal. No matter how formidable a person may seem, there is always a place where mortality resides. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of Achilles is not his heel, nor even his wrath. It is his choice. When given the option of long obscurity or brief renown, he chose renown. In doing so, he aligned himself with a core value of ancient Greek heroic culture: kleos, the glory that survives death through story. And here we are, more than 2,000 years later, speaking his name. The city of Troy itself lay buried for centuries before archaeological efforts in modern times uncovered layers of ancient settlement near Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey. Scholars debate how much of the epic corresponds to historical events, whether there was a single Trojan War or a conflation of multiple conflicts. But regardless of the historical layers, Achilles remains vividly alive in cultural memory. History can blur, ruins can erode, but story endures. In that sense, Achilles achieved exactly what he sought. He did not live to old age. He did not return to Phthia to rule beside his father Peleus. He did not watch his son Neoptolemus grow into manhood. He died young. But his name did not. And perhaps that is the quiet, reflective truth at the heart of his legend. Achilles represents the human desire to matter, to leave a mark, to burn brightly enough that the darkness cannot fully erase you. Yet his story also reminds us of the cost of such brightness: the grief of Thetis, the suffering of Priam, the destruction of Troy, the loneliness that followed his triumph. The world of gods and heroes may seem distant from our own, but the emotions within it are not. Pride, love, anger, regret. Achilles' life contains them all, intensified to mythic scale. And so when we look back across the long arc of his story, from the prophecy at his birth, to his training under Chiron, to the quarrel with Agamemnon, to the death of Patroclus, to the slaying of Hector, and finally to the arrow guided by fate, we see more than a warrior's biography. We see a meditation on what it means to live intensely in a world where death is certain. Achilles' immortality was never literal. It was narrative. It was memory carried across generations. It was the quiet moment when someone, somewhere, tells his story again. By firelight, by lamplight, or in the hush of night. And in that retelling, the son of Thetis rises once more, not as flesh and bone, but as legend. When we look back across the long arc of Achilles' life, what remains most striking is not merely the scale of his strength, nor even the magnitude of the war that surrounded him. It is the clarity of his awareness. From early youth, Achilles knew. He was not ignorant of his destiny. He was not dragged blindly into tragedy. He stood at a crossroads and understood the cost of each path laid before him. That knowledge transforms his story from simple heroism into something more profound. Many figures in myth are caught by fate. Achilles chose it. When his mother, Thetis, warned him that going to Troy would mean early death, she was not speaking in riddles. The prophecy was direct. If he remained in Phthia, he would live long but be forgotten. If he sailed to war, he would die young, but his glory would never fade. This choice sits at the heart of his legend. To modern ears, it may sound reckless. Why would anyone choose a short life over a long one? Yet within the heroic culture of ancient Greece, the question was more complex. Life was fragile. Disease, accident, and war could end it at any moment. To live long was not necessarily to live meaningfully. Achilles wanted significance. He wanted his name to endure beyond his body. In this way, he becomes a symbol of a timeless human tension, the pull between safety and greatness, and yet, as later traditions suggest, especially in the encounter between Achilles and Odysseus in the underworld, there may have been regret. If Achilles truly declared that he would rather be a living servant than a king among the dead, then even the greatest champion recognized the irreplaceable value of breath, sunlight, and the simple act of being alive. But that reflection comes after the fact. During his life, Achilles lived fully within the framework of the heroic ideal. He excelled in every dimension valued by his culture. He was unmatched in combat. He was swift beyond compare. He inspired fear in enemies and loyalty in his followers. His grief for Patroclus reveals depth of love and devotion. His meeting with Priam reveals capacity for empathy even after terrible violence. He was not one-dimensional. And that complexity is precisely why his story endures. Consider the arc of his transformation. At first, Achilles is defined by wounded pride. His quarrel with Agamemnon is rooted in honor. The seizure of Briseis is more than personal insult. It is a public diminishment. Achilles withdraws not because he fears battle, but because he refuses to fight without respect. This withdrawal nearly destroys the Greek cause. Yet when Patroclus dies, Achilles' motivation shifts. Pride gives way to grief. His return to battle is not for glory, but for vengeance. His slaying of Hector becomes both justice and excess, culminating in the desecration of Hector's body. Then, in the quiet moment with Priam, something changes again. Achilles remembers his father, Peleus. He recognizes shared humanity across enemy lines. He returns Hector's body. In that gesture, he transcends the cycle of wrath that began the epic. His story is not static. It evolves. Even his death reflects paradox. He cannot be defeated in open combat by any ordinary warrior. Instead, he falls to an arrow guided, according to many traditions, by Apollo, loosed by Paris. The greatest of fighters is undone not by strength equal to his own, but by vulnerability hidden and exploited. The image of the heel endures because it speaks beyond myth. Every person, no matter how formidable, carries a weakness. Sometimes it is physical, sometimes it is emotional. For Achilles, his physical vulnerability is almost symbolic of his emotional one. His deep capacity for love makes him powerful, but also makes him susceptible to devastating grief. The Trojan War itself, though legendary in form, likely grew from real conflicts in the late Bronze Age. Archaeological excavations at the site, traditionally identified as Troy, reveal layers of destruction and rebuilding. While historians debate the precise relationship between epic and history, the persistence of the narrative suggests that something about it resonated deeply with those who told it. Achilles is central to that resonance. He is not simply a character within the war. He is the emotional axis around which the epic turns. Without him, the war becomes a sequence of events. With him, it becomes a drama of human passion, and this is perhaps the reason why the epic, known as the Iliad, attributed to Homer, ends not with the fall of Troy, but with Hector's funeral. The poem does not need to describe the wooden horse or the burning city. Its true subject has already been explored: the cost of anger, the inevitability of mortality, and the fragile beauty of compassion. Achilles achieves Kleos, eternal glory, but he does so at immense cost. He loses Patroclus. He loses his own future. He never returns home. Yet in another sense, he never truly leaves. His name echoes across centuries. Alexander the Great is said to have admired Achilles deeply, even visiting the supposed tomb at Troy. Roman poets incorporated him into their own cultural narratives. Medieval writers reimagined him through different moral lenses. Modern literature, theater, and film continue to revisit his story, each generation finding new angles within the old tale. Why? Because Achilles embodies intensity. He feels deeply. He acts decisively. He confronts fate knowingly, and in doing so, he reveals both the grandeur and the fragility of human aspiration. Perhaps the final reflection lies not in his battles, but in his awareness. He knew his life would be short. He knew that each victory brought him closer to death. Yet he stepped forward anyway. There is courage in that. Not the simple courage of facing an enemy with a shield raised, but the existential courage of embracing a chosen destiny despite its cost. In the end, Achilles is neither purely tragic nor purely triumphant. He is human, elevated into myth, magnified into legend, but still recognizably human in his emotions and contradictions. And so his story continues to be told. In quiet rooms, across oceans, under starlit skies, not so different from those that once shone over the plains of Troy. The sea still moves. The wind still carries names. And among those names, spoken softly or boldly, one endures above most: Achilles. Long after the fires of Troy cooled, and the last embers of its fallen towers faded into ash, the question of Achilles remained. Not merely who he was, but what he meant. To the ancient Greeks, Achilles was not simply a warrior whose feats deserved admiration. He was an embodiment of their deepest values and anxieties. Through him, they explored what it meant to be great in a world ruled by fate. shaped by gods, and bounded by death. The culture that produced Achilles did not imagine immortality in the way later traditions would. There was no promise of paradise awaiting the righteous hero. The underworld was a shadowed realm, a dim reflection of life, where even kings wandered without sunlight. For mortals, the only true immortality was memory. This is why Achilles' choice mattered so profoundly. When he stood at the crossroads between a long, obscure life and a short, glorious one, he was not simply choosing between years. He was choosing between vanishing and being remembered. In choosing glory, he aligned himself with a central Greek ideal: to live so intensely that one's name would outlast the body. And yet, that choice carried a quiet tragedy. The Greeks did not imagine their heroes as invulnerable in spirit. Achilles wept openly. He raged. He doubted. He mourned Patroclus with a grief that shook even the gods. His tears did not diminish him. They deepened him. In this, Achilles becomes more than a symbol of martial excellence. He becomes a study in emotional extremity. His anger at Agamemnon is not petty temper. It is a crisis of identity. In a culture where honor defined a man's worth, to be publicly dishonored was to be symbolically diminished. Achilles' withdrawal from battle reveals how deeply he valued recognition. But his transformation after the death of Patroclus reveals something even more powerful: love. The nature of Achilles and Patroclus's bond has been interpreted in different ways across centuries. Some see them as brothers in arms, bound by loyalty. Others see romantic devotion woven into their connection. What remains indisputable is the depth of their attachment. Achilles' grief is raw and overwhelming. It drives him beyond pride into vengeance. It breaks him open. Through that grief, the epic moves from a story of honor to a story of loss. And through his meeting with Priam, Achilles transcends even vengeance. When Priam kneels and kisses the hands that killed his son, the moment crystallizes the shared vulnerability of enemies. Achilles sees his own father, Peleus, in Priam's sorrow. The divide between Greek and Trojan dissolves, if only briefly, into shared humanity. This scene stands as one of the most extraordinary in ancient literature. It suggests that even the greatest warrior is not defined solely by the enemies he defeats, but by the mercy he can extend. In that instant, Achilles is no longer driven by rage. He becomes reflective, almost gentle. He honors Hector's body. He allows Troy time to mourn. And yet, fate remains unaltered. The arrow guided by Apollo, loosed by Paris, fulfills the prophecy spoken long ago. Achilles falls not in grand duel, but through vulnerability. There is irony in this. The mightiest warrior undone by a single well-placed arrow. But perhaps the irony is the point. No matter how strong, no matter how glorious, every mortal carries a point of weakness. The phrase Achilles' heel has endured not because it describes a physical detail, but because it captures a universal truth. Strength does not eliminate vulnerability. It coexists with it. Across generations, Achilles has been reinterpreted through shifting cultural lenses. To some, he is the ultimate warrior, fearless and decisive. To others, he is a cautionary figure, consumed by pride and rage. To philosophers, he becomes a case study in the ethics of honor and the psychology of anger. Even his reported words in the underworld, preferring life as a servant over kingship among the dead, introduce ambiguity. Did Achilles regret his choice? Or was that line a poetic device emphasizing the bleakness of death? The ambiguity keeps him alive. Unlike heroes who stand for simple virtues, Achilles resists reduction. He is magnificent and flawed. He is loyal and merciless. He is tender and terrifying. And perhaps that is why he remains compelling long after other figures fade into obscurity. The Trojan War, whether historical or mythologized, becomes in literature less about territorial conquest and more about human experience intensified. The siege stretches for years, not simply to dramatize conflict, but to explore endurance of cities, of relationships, of pride. Within that vast canvas, Achilles burns brightest. Even those who opposed him, like Hector, gained stature precisely because they faced him. Hector's courage is magnified by the scale of the opponent he confronts. The tragedy of Troy deepens because its greatest defender falls to the greatest attacker. When later cultures inherited the myth, they did not discard Achilles. They wrestled with him. Roman poets, though sympathetic to Trojan descendants like Aeneas, still portrayed Achilles as a figure of awe. Medieval writers reshaped him through chivalric ideals. Modern storytellers examine him psychologically, probing the interior life of the warrior. In each retelling, something of the original remains: intensity. He does not live halfway. He does not love halfway. He does not fight halfway. In a quieter sense, Achilles represents youth itself, brilliant, passionate, impatient with compromise. His life is brief, but incandescent. He does not have the tempered wisdom of old age. He has the blazing certainty of someone who believes the present moment must be seized fully. And then he is gone. Perhaps that is why his story feels both grand and fragile. It reminds us that even the brightest flame cannot burn indefinitely. But while it burns, it illuminates everything around it. As long as his name is spoken, as long as his story is told in hushed rooms and long-form narratives, Achilles continues to live in the only way mortals can: through memory, through reflection, through the echo of a name carried forward by those who listen. And so, from the prophecy whispered at his birth to the arrow that ended his life, Achilles remains not merely a warrior of bronze and spear, but a mirror held up to the human condition itself. When all battles are finished and all cities reduced to dust, what remains is not the clash of bronze or the thunder of chariots. What remains is the echo. And Achilles, more than any other warrior of the Trojan War, became an echo that refused to fade. The mound raised over his ashes near the Hellespont stood for generations as a marker between land and sea. Sailors navigating those narrow waters would look toward the shore and speak of him. The place where Europe and Asia almost touch became a place of memory. It is fitting. Achilles lived at the boundary between mortal and divine, between man and legend. His tomb stood at the boundary between continents. His mother, Thetis, returned to the sea, carrying her grief into the deep. The sea itself becomes symbolic in his story. It is where he sat in anger when he withdrew from battle. It is where he called for his mother. It is the horizon he crossed when he chose glory. It is the element that framed both his beginning and his end. The sea remembers in waves. It does not hold shape, yet it does not forget. In the centuries that followed, Achilles' story was told and retold around hearth fires, in royal courts, in festivals, and in classrooms. The epic known as the Iliad, attributed to Homer, ensured that his wrath would open one of the foundational works of Western literature. That opening invocation, calling upon the muse to sing of Achilles' anger, places his emotional life at the center of cultural memory. It is extraordinary when you consider it. Not the triumph of armies, not the strategy of kings, but the anger of one man becomes the axis of the story. Why? Because within that anger is the full spectrum of humanity. His quarrel with Agamemnon exposes the fragile structure of leadership. Authority without respect collapses. Pride clashes with pride. Armies suffer. His love for Patroclus reveals devotion so profound that it overturns earlier grievances. Pride dissolves in grief. The same warrior who once refused to fight becomes unstoppable when loss touches him personally. His slaying of Hector reveals both justice and excess. It fulfills vengeance, but tips into cruelty. The dragging of Hector's body stains his heroism, reminding us that even the greatest can lose themselves in rage. And yet, his encounter with Priam restores something essential. In the shared sorrow of father and son, enemy and enemy become simply human. Achilles' willingness to return Hector's body becomes one of the most powerful gestures in ancient storytelling. It suggests that even in a world shaped by honor and blood, compassion can interrupt destruction. These layers are why Achilles endures. He is not perfect. He is not purely noble. He is not purely monstrous. He is vast. And within that vastness, audiences across millennia find reflection. In later generations, when thinkers revisited the story, they often paused on his choice. The crossroads between long obscurity and short glory becomes philosophical. What is the measure of a life? Is it length? Is it impact? Is it love? Is it remembrance? Achilles chose remembrance, but remembrance is complex. To be remembered is to be interpreted. Each era reshapes him slightly. Some see him as the ultimate warrior, a model of courage. Others see him as a warning about unchecked pride. Some focus on the tenderness revealed in grief, others on the destructiveness of rage. Perhaps the truth lies in the tension. Achilles is the hero who forces us to confront the cost of intensity. He burns brightly, but brightness consumes fuel. He achieves eternal fame, but forfeits ordinary joys. He becomes legend, but loses the quiet possibility of growing old beside his father Peleus, watching seasons change. There is something profoundly human in that trade. Even today, far removed from chariots and bronze armor, people stand at their own crossroads, not always as dramatic, not always framed by prophecy, but choices between safety and ambition, between comfort and risk, between anonymity and visibility. Achilles becomes symbolic of that moment when someone chooses to step forward despite knowing there is danger. And then there is the vulnerability. The image of the heel, untouched by the waters of the river Styx, is one of the most enduring metaphors in human language. It reminds us that strength does not erase fragility. In fact, the greater the strength, the more striking the fragility when it is revealed. His death at the hands of Paris, aided by Apollo, reinforces another theme central to ancient thought. Even the greatest are subject to forces beyond their control. Fate weaves through every life, but fate alone does not define Achilles. choice does. He could have remained in Phthia. He could have returned home after the quarrel. He could have let Hector live. Each turning point reveals agency within inevitability. That interplay between destiny and decision is what gives a story enduring power. When Troy finally fell, Achilles was no longer alive to see it. The wooden horse entered the gates without him. The flames that consumed Priam's city rose without his witness. In a quiet way, this feels fitting. The epic that centers on his wrath ends before the war does. His story is complete not when Troy falls, but when he confronts his own humanity. The fall of Troy is spectacle. The fall of Achilles is meaning. And so the sea continues its rhythm. Waves strike the shore near the ancient ruins believed to be Troy. Wind moves across the plains where myth and history intertwine. Travelers stand at the site and imagine the clash of armies long gone. But what they often remember most vividly is not the scale of the war. It is a single figure, a young warrior with swift feet and unyielding pride, a friend who wept, a son who knew he would die, a man who chose glory and paid for it, Achilles. His life was brief. His impact was immense. His story, carried across centuries in poetry, scholarship, and whispered retellings, continues to move like the sea that framed his beginning. And as long as stories are told, slowly, thoughtfully, under dim light or starlit sky, the son of Thetis will rise again in memory, not as flesh, not as armor gleaming in the sun, but as something perhaps more enduring, a name that refuses to fade. And now, the fires of Troy have long since faded. The armor has cooled, the ships have sailed, the voices of kings and warriors have quieted into wind. Achilles, swift-footed, radiant, flawed, unforgettable, has returned to legend. Tonight, we walked beside him from prophecy to battlefield, from pride to grief, from fury to reflection. We watched him choose glory, carry love, endure loss, and meet fate without turning away. And now, as this story comes to rest, I invite you to let it soften. Let the clash of bronze dissolve into the sound of distant waves. Let the tension of war ease into stillness. If you've made it all the way to the end of this journey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What city? What country? What quiet room or late night hour are you sharing this story in? Leave it in the comments. I always read them, and it's incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you found peace, comfort, or meaning in this long telling, consider subscribing. There are many more journeys waiting. Slow, immersive stories designed to help you unwind, reflect, and drift gently toward rest. For now, take a slow breath. Let your thoughts settle. The war is over. The sea is calm. And somewhere, far beyond the noise of the present world, the name Achilles still echoes. No, not in Innan. Not in battle, but in memory. Good night.